Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us on this very sultry, wet Parisian day. I am here to just welcome you to the University of Chicago John Boyer Center in Paris. And once again, because we have slightly different audiences with each moment of this symposium, to just say that it's been generously supported by several entities. The University of Chicago Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization, of which collaborator Sabina Shaikh and Carlo Diaz and I are part. Chicago Global and the International Institute of Research in Paris, as well as Université Gustave Eiffel Laboratoire Littérature, Savoir et Art, which was generously supported my invited professorship some years ago, which was really the germ of my even being able to conceive of undertaking this collaboration with Olivier Brossard, who is now going to take the mic and introduce our closing keynote speaker, Lisa Robertson.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm just going to say a few words from the Lisa's bio and then a more personal bio note. Canadian poet, essayist, and novelist Lisa Robertson lives in France, in Nalliers. There's two Nalliers, actually, but it's the one in Poitou, not in Vendée. She has been a visiting poet and professor in various universities, including the University of Chicago. In 2017, she was awarded an honorary doctorate in letters by Emily Carr University of Art and Design. And in 2018, she received the C.D. Wright Award in Poetry from the FCA in New York. She's published 9 books of poetry, most recently Boat, 2022. I'll say a few words about it. 2 books of essays, Kneeling, 2012, and Occasional Work and 7 Walks from the Office for Soft Architecture, 2003, as well as a novel, The Baudelaire Fractal, which was published in 2020. Anemones, a Simone Weil project, If I Can't Dance, published by If I Can't Dance, came out in 2021 in Amsterdam. And it's her annotated translation of Simone Weil's 1942 essay on the troubadour poets and the Cathar heresy. It's a study of rhyme and the troubadour tradition in poetry and poetics. She's currently writing a second novel, Riverwork, which she will read from and tell us about today. And it's based on research on the Bièvre River in Paris, which flows into the Seine a few blocks away from here. And on a more personal note, I would like to say that, sometimes you realize that you are alive at the same time as a writer that you cherish. Yeah, this is gonna be embarrassing. It's not hot enough. I'm not gonna say that, although I would very much like to say that, but I just wanted to say that today I was lucky enough to be on the same boat as Lisa Robertson, and this book that was published 3 years ago now, is just really wonderful. And there's just 2 quotes from it that I would like to just to share with you as a sort of echo to the 2 days that we shared together. The first one is that and it's page 47. The poem is a proposition about the form of knowing. And what I found fascinating over the past few days is the meeting, the merging of poetry, poetics, understood in the broad sense of the term, and knowledge and production of knowledge. And the second one is a line where, page 75, where Lisa writes, "I'd like to make a legitimate contribution to uncertainty." And I think it's really, really a beautiful line and program, and I invite you to welcome Lisa Robertson.
I'm trying to turn on my mic. I'm not doing calisthenics. Does that, okay, it's working. Great, great. Thank you very much, Jennifer and Olivier, and any other members of the University of Chicago who are present, and everybody who was on the boat for 7 hours together today. And this has been a remarkable gathering of people across several disciplines, which is a rare enough event in academic life, really, where we who work in the field of poetry, stopped working.
Sorry.
Is it still working? Okay. Had the opportunity to learn from urban geologists, from water ecologists, from experimental architects, and join our thinking together. So I was extremely happy to be invited and to have the opportunity to participate with all of you. Jennifer invited me because she knows, as my friends know, so it's a big repetition. I've been working for seemingly forever, which is to say 4 years, on a novel called Riverwork. And what I'm going to read to you tonight is a montage, really, of fragments I've made just for this evening. So it's not a complete section. It's an edit for the purposes of this gathering. And the basic research that this novel is coming out of is, as Jen and Olivier mentioned, my interest in the Bièvre River, the suppressed tributary of the Seine, which I will be describing in this text, so I won't give you geographical information about it. And I've been particularly interested in forms of work and bodies of work, which we could, like the river, refer to as inexistent landscapes. This is a phrase from Laurence earlier today, because these forms of work were executed by the gendered bodies of women. So the Bièvre River Valley was the site of textile production and transformation from the 15th century until the mid-19th century. And that transformation and production included weaving and dyeing and starching and laundry. And this afternoon, I, with the help of everybody on the boat, presented fragments of research pertaining to the history of laundresses and their political engagements in ecological movements in the Commune of 1871, etc. So that's one vein of my curiosity in this inexistent landscape. And the figure of the laundress set a tone for other directions that the novel moves in. The narrator of the novel is a cleaning lady, and there are just four characters who don't. Only one of them really entirely figures in this part that I'm reading. The narrator works she does domestic labor for a retired archivist, a very elderly woman. She becomes, in that household, the friend of a man who works as a private nurse also for the archivist. And the narrator and the novel takes place in Paris, and she's in Paris because she has tracked a family member, a great aunt, who spent her youth in Paris, and then after having to return to Canada during the time of the Second World War and the Great Depression, ended up experiencing mental illness and incarcerations, and escaped from that more than confining situation to return to Paris, where she disappeared. So the narrator has become obsessed with this disappeared elder in her family story, and she takes up the research of the disappeared aunt. And so you will be hearing about the aunt. Her name is M, but she's generally just referred to as my aunt. And insofar as this is a work about inexistent landscapes, one of those landscapes is the landscape of research. And I'm interested in research as a form of work, and the forms it takes and its effective grounds, how research is transmitted over time, what gets researched by whom, and how that fragmented body of knowledge moves among communities and generations. So there are several layers of disappearance and non-appearing, which connect at different points, and that's what this novel Riverwork performs. After I read, we'll have the opportunity to chat, if you'd like to, either more formally in this frontal situation or less formally as we have some refreshments. So I'm happy to entertain comments or questions after I read. I'm beginning this montage with a quote by a French writer named Alfred Delvau. Alfred Delvau, as I've explained to Cole earlier, I'm repeating things which other people have heard today, so apologies for that. Delvau was born to dyers in Paris on the Bièvre River, and he was the same generation as Baudelaire, with whom he was friends. And Walter Benjamin cites Delvau pretty often in the Arcades, I think 4 or 5 times in the Arcades project. But among those citations, he does not mention or cite from the book in which Delvau writes about his upbringing and his childhood on the banks of the Bièvre. Nor does Benjamin at any point ever mention the Bièvre River in the Arcades project. So I'll enter into that a little bit. So this is from Alfred Delvau. And there's an interesting translation problem. I translated this little wee passage. But there are the proper nouns naiads and tritons. And of course, we know that naiads and tritons are mythological, Greek beings. But they're also, in French, the proper names for aquatic forms of life, whereas where naiads are water lilies and tritons are newts. So I wasn't able to carry that into my translation, so I just wanted, it's just a nice little sub-layer in this. What sounds very lofty because of its mythic reference is actually also a reference to the aquatic life of the Bièvre River. I wasn't born for nothing in the middle of Faubourg Saint-Marceau, between the Rue Mouffetard and the Horse Market, on the banks of that hardly poetical river called the Bièvre, where the naiads are laundresses and the tritons are tanners. My childhood didn't pass for nothing on the banks of that black creek, listening to the discordant noise of the laundry paddles and the hammers on the mountains of oak bark rising in the courtyard of my father's house, watching the northern wheat ears forage on the ground. These are the city's rivers. The brook of Ménilmontant, which served as a sewer, running down from the eastern heights to the Place de République. From the north, the river Ourcq, which brought wheat and firewood into the city from the 16th century on. The skimpy but truculent Bièvre, tributary to the Seine, beginning in the forest of Goncourt, from the Middle Ages, the center of textile manufacture, supporting the city's many fiber industries until the 19th century. Finally suppressed in 1912 following the hygienic logic of Baron Haussmann. The river Grange Batelière, which was perhaps apocryphal, but which was also perhaps the recipient of all the gutter water of the right bank. The brook of Montreuil, also called Pissotte, covered over at the end of the 1840s. The brook of Saint-Germain, which flowed from Montparnasse into the Seine near the site of the present fountain at Place Saint-Michel, and the Seine, beginning in the northeast at the Langres Plateau and flowing into the English Channel at Le Havre. The history of the flooding of the Bièvre River is known, described, and documented. Floods brutal and strong. Floods catastrophic, menacing, capricious, clandestine. Waters miry, slimy, of cruel character. Floods brutal and devastating, uprooting trees, demolishing houses, lapping the steps of the churches. Violent, invasive, totally devastating, exceptional floods. Muddy, ferocious torrents. Deluges, ravages, often capricious, famously in 1479, the 15th of May in 1526, or perhaps 1527, on the 1st or the 8th or the 15th of April in 1529, the flood called Saint Marcel's flood, where the water entered the houses up to the 3rd floor, drowning 12 sleepers in their beds. The 10th of June, 1573, a famous flood of 30 hours beginning on a Wednesday in 1579, when, after 2 full days of rain, 25 men, women, and little children were drowned, some buried beneath the rubble of ruined houses. Also, 40 wounded and livestock washed away and missing. The day after Pentecost, in 1625, many ancient gardens and mansions gutted. The 25th to the 28th of January, 1665, and the 28th of February, 1665, after which 40 corpses were fished out, not counting the lost. May 1871, when the bullet-riddled cadavers of 13 insurgent communards were tossed into its already festering waters. The 29th of May in 1901, when boats floated up the Rue de Bièvre. The 18th of January 1910, when the basements of the Ministry of the Interior filled. 1928, the 22nd of July in 1982. after 110 millimeters of precipitation in 3 hours, 2001. When Rousseau wanders outside Paris in the valley of the Bièvre River in his 66th year, there is no flooding. He is writing his final book, a suite of perambulatory reveries. He will not complete it. It is summer in Paris, and a woman sells fruit and sweets from a little stall at the exit of the city, the one popularly called Gate of Hell, as her little boy, hobbling on crutches, cheerfully begs from the passers-by. Still, the itinerant fruit sellers work these makeshift stands on the summer streets or in the metro stations, having laid a wide scrubbed plank across 2 or 3 fruit crates stood on end at the edge of the traffic, and having set out attractive mounds of cherries, apricots, some melons. By midsummer, with any luck, tied bunches of lavender. It's the 6th walk of Reveries of a Solitary Walker, and the old man is on his way to go botanizing on the banks of the river. Often, botanizing serves as a premise for his rambles, and he names his favorite herbarium, Murray's Regnum Vegetabile, mentioning that he has had to copy it out because it was too dear to buy. And here I think of Sarah Hutchinson copying out the index of witherings and arrangement of British plants in Coleridge's notebook in the summer of 1800, having borrowed a copy from Wordsworth because the book was so costly. And I think, too, about the value of a good herbarium to the writers, and about this odd little preposition, out, in this locution, copying out, the way it suggests the transcribed text has been extruded from the original, like a cast object being turned out of its mold, or an outpouring, the text flowing out to the world. Now, in the 6th walk, after mentioning it in passing, he drops the botanical theme, which has provided him with a pretext for leaving the city on foot, and he begins to reflect on the underlying meaning of a habitual route he takes, cutting off through the fields, he says, following the Fontainebleau road to a ridge that runs parallel to what he calls this little river. The river plays a very small role in this reverie. It simply serves to indicate the countryside beyond the city proper, where the haunted philosopher would go in order to botanize and forget his troubles and persecutions. Though I wonder if the Bièvre's meandering path doesn't quietly shape Rousseau's reverie, any reverie which necessarily proceeds by detour and diversion, rather than intention, a derive. Seen from above, or in a map of the city, the Bièvre curves in an S shape as it arrives from Chantilly at the eastern limits of Paris. At the bottom of the S, the river divides into 2 courses, one man-made, called the living, and the other, comparatively natural, called the dead. The older, abject, dead branch, with its putrid, paltry trickle, was stagnant. The newer branch, dug in the 12th century and again in 1550, retained a flow and a current just deep enough to support the river's various industries: pigment mills, oak bark grinders for tanning, suet melters, abattoirs, candle makers, acid distilleries, as well as grain mills. We're on the site of a grain mill here, paper mills, and the textile workshops, whether for valued tapestries or for common sheeting. Also, laundries, parchment cures, and tanneries, all banished to the Bièvre from the Seine in the 16th century in order to preserve the larger river for transportation and domestic water use. Strange now to say that it had not then been considered that the industrial filth of the Bièvre simply was carried along by the little river to reach the larger one. The two parallel streams of the Bièvre continue their sharply curving route until the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, where they join together again and flow slightly to the east to pass the Jardins des Plantes, emptying into the Seine near the Pont d'Austerlitz. Or this was the case before the Bièvre's final disappearance in 1912. At the time of Rousseau's walk, 1778, the limits of Paris were situated at the bottom of the S, now Place d'Enfer Rochereau, where the little river divided into its two arms as it entered the city. Why this detour, he asks himself as he walks towards the city gate. He realizes with irritation that he hadn't been conscious of his reasons for first choosing the now habitual roundabout way. On reflection, he sees that he follows the river out of the city to avoid the obligation, now become customary, of greeting the fruit seller's child and giving him some coins. He had become weary of the exaggerated attention of the little boy on crutches, a boy whose happy chatter he at first enjoyed and reciprocated. This small social habit, the play of its accumulating insincerity, has become a duty, a burden he would rather avoid. So just before the Porte d'Enfer and the sight of the fruit seller's stall, he heads off into the fields. We're right in that site. We're practically on Rousseau's route where this building stands now. As he follows this detour along the Bièvre, he sees that very often his quotidian motives are not clear. The psychic work of reverie, he believes, is to move from a state of confusion and conflict to one of clarity and simplicity, as if the polluting freight could simply be left behind. Having now abandoned botany to reverie, his meandering walk becomes the medium for a self-analysis on the relation between spontaneous desire and obligation. Sexual desire is part of this. So are daily acts of unstudied kindness to friends and strangers, such as his exchanges with the child he now avoids. Pleasure vanishes, he explains, when kind acts become contractual bonds of relationship through repetition. He experiences this bond as a form of enslavement. He who gives is enslaved by he who receives, says Rousseau, in a grotesque appropriation of political meaning, as if his social blindness is proof of the delicacy and authenticity of his sentiment. Could he really think that the little discomforts of his age and his exile are equivalent to the horror experienced by people stolen into slavery? He seemed to use the word slavery as a vague moral metaphor. Yet, in 1778, the year he wrote this text, French traders transported 13,000 Africans to enslavement, forced labor, and death on sugar, coffee, cocoa, and cotton plantations in the West Indies. By the time his book was published in 1782, that number had doubled. Rousseau was no abolitionist, even if his writings on liberty were to influence the Black Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture, according to C.L.R. James. Rousseau's reverie by the river becomes a bloated defense of his chosen social passivity. He thinks he must abstain from acting in order to not become enslaved, in order to remain blameless and free, following the impulses of his heart, as he explains. And it is only as a stranger, he believes, apart from all the habits and repetitions of social relationships, that he can follow those impulses, so evading what he called enslavement. This is why he leaves the city to go into the fields and botanize by way of the little river, as he calls it, the roundabout way, and not by way of the new boulevard, evading enslavement, as meanwhile in Saint-Domingue, Francois Macandale had already led the first slave rebellion and it had accordingly been burned at the stake. And as the free black Toussaint Louverture was refining his own political education, reading Rousseau in preparation for revolution. Just now, on a hot summer morning in a 6th-floor apartment in the 11th arrondissement of Paris, the shutters half closed against the sun, I'm rereading this walk to check whether my memories haven't misshapen what Rousseau wrote out, although I have read his promenades countless times over the years. I'm obsessed by his misappropriated concept of enslavement. He is obsessed by his own so-called goodness. Now in my rereading, I find that what irritates Rousseau most about his exchanges with the fruit seller's son is that the little boy unfailingly calls him by his name, Monsieur Rousseau. To be named is to be obligated. A list of oblique light filters through the shutters and across the pages of the book. He says he is unfit for social life. He makes the detour near the Bièvre in order to not be called by his name. Rousseau sounds like Ruisseau, little creek. And here I am naming him repeatedly, and how can he ever evade this endlessly echoing interpolation? And shouldn't I just leave him to drift in peace, botanizing by the river, and never again write out his name? I who have now taken on the role of the little boy who begs for coins for his mother, calling out the long-esteemed syllables with my inelegant accent, my rough Nordic R, gamely and cheerily demonstrating my little education, I who have now appropriated for my own use the meandering path of the aging philosopher along his little river. Ribboning into Paris from the villages, on bed of clay with escort of poplar, quick and skimpy, rough-built, populated by beavers and eels, next made over, harnessed as millstream, diverted through monastery vineyards, market gardens, the pleasure grounds of the textile industrialists, bright expanses of freshly soaked toile de Jouy spread to dry on the grassy banks near the source. Eventually toward the city, the sluice of the offal of abattoirs and tanneries, carrying the stink of retted linen and hemp, winding dark brown between university and quarry, hemmed in by masonry, hugging the back of the Baroque weaving works, rinsing the red yarns of tapestries that would furnish palaces and fortunes. A river arrives, described by its banks, bearing on its foaming surface leaking laundry barges charged with washerwomen who have come in from the villages to work, their bare arms plunged armpit deep into wooden vats of slick and greenish water, their lilac camisoles and straw hats, their raucous pounding and singing. And if they sell some pleasure to supplement their purses, why shouldn't they? There's scarcely a living to be made from the city's laundry. Its soiled and reeking bed linens, sometimes pestilent, its cruddy napkins, tablecloths, swaddling cloths, night shirts, and shifts, whether finest Indian lawn, damask linen, silken fil de lin, or homespun hemp worn silvery by sleepers, the sleepers turning in hospitals, asylums, prisons, convents, hotels, or in the well-appointed bourgeois mansions. There is fever, corruption, seasonal dredging, argumentation, at times the earnest desire for betterment, the strikes of the underpaid laundresses, dumping bylaws and their forgetting in abandonment, the grown-over fallow laundry-drying lots where next lovers hide and drunks nap and brats play at dice. Now a ditch, a brackish gob, a sewer, a conduit, a culvert, a fiction, nothing, the ribboning city under the city. She is looking for a room within her budget. She is brushing against a stranger in the street in her haste. She is promiscuous. Her scuffed Oxfords have a small heel but remain sensible. She suffers an innocuous jostling and calls out, "Hey!" She scans the front page of a newspaper while standing at a kiosk. Her bright lipstick is smeared. She goes to the library. She wanders. She copies with lust. Her neck and shoulders become tight. My neck and shoulders are tight. We're buffeted by politics even when we don't care. It's 1929. The city is alive in our discomfort. She was my great aunt, but I called her Aunt. Her name was M. I stole her documents. She left them behind when she went. Documents, grimy notebooks, curling snapshots, a cheap dark blue hardbound volume of Poe with loose binding, postmarked envelopes stained with cup rings, scrappy jottings, sundry research lists and bibliographies, the vigorous silence of closed files of papers, their soft or frayed edges spilling out. Also, all the ill-sorted index cards tied together in tattered bundles, some hand-cut, letters separated from their envelopes, drafts and fragments of reading notes in worn buff-colored folders, notes handwritten on yellow foolscap, some typed on a manual typewriter, stray sheets of carbon paper worn translucent with absent texts, an emotional dream of philosophy that never did stop, blurred carbon copies of typewritten translations of Chateaubriand, unfinished, foxed pamphlets, a memory of madder red dye bleeding from long patch velvet curtains. Sometimes a crumpled sheet of writing bore a faint footprint, and also extraneous material such as an unlabeled miscellaneous strip of red woolen cloth, a lock of blonde hair tightly tied with blue thread, a long splinter of dark wood, a clipped-off cream satin garment label reading Schiaparelli in red woven script, and a hinged aqua green flat leatherette box of costume jewelry, all of it broken, rings without stones, necklaces without clasps, a chunky rhinestone brooch missing its pin, rattling beads, loose souvenir charms from an absent bracelet, the tarnished commemorative coin of something. Intermingled with my filched inheritance, a gritty dust. Maybe I dreamt the documents and the junk jewels. Maybe I embellished the paucity that survived, the flood-dampened books spread under the sun to dry, the speckling of spores on paper, the fluid yellow curves of the crisply warped foredges, tang of mildew penetrating my lungs. Maybe I dreamt the grubby index cards and the dust that moved from documents to skin, even as it renewed itself in the earlier location, a translation. I stole or I dreamt my great-aunt's documents. Say, after her bachelor's degree in Toronto, she had traveled to Paris as a graduate student to study French literature at the Sorbonne. In Paris, she flourished. She found a social abundance entirely lacking in her birthplace, or so it seemed to my aunt, whose circles in that earlier city had been circumscribed by family restrictions, the chilly customs and judgments of WASP social climbers. In Paris, young Irish poets in sturdy tweeds held court in Latin Quarter cafes at the zinc bars that were cheaper than tables, drinking coffee or whiskey according to the time of day. My great-aunt had a sweet tooth and preferred port. She read and talked and danced and drank in equal measure, and then she slept thoroughly to awake refreshed in her shabby room. The flea markets supplied arcane books and textiles, and the libraries and bookshops were teeming. She noted the odd intimacy of books, cloth, and water in this place. Shambling bouquiniste stalls lined both quays of the River Seine, and behind the university, the old Bièvre, only recently covered, had for centuries been the site of parchment curing, paper mills, weaving, and bookbinding. The environs of its old banks were still rife with bookshops that spilled across the pavements as they had done since the establishment of the university in 1200. It was a scholar's city of overflowing archives, both official ones and the contingent ones, of resplendently mirrored plate glass cafes and bare, modest rooms lacking plumbing, of cacophonous morning street markets and public parks, of chestnut trees and Baroque fountains, of painting-filled public palaces and the zinc-domed newspaper kiosks, which sprawled outwards willy-nilly from the octagonal green columns in gloriously improvised architectures. Here, my aunt became herself. Already the river was gone, the old factories and tanneries torn down, and the run-down neighborhoods where the laundresses called out. She would have written this in 1927 or 8, still a student. Problem: to research the afterlife of obsolescence. While pursuing her studies of Chateaubriand and Rousseau at the Sorbonne, my great-aunt discovered her devotion to the absent river that would come to determine my life. My various attempts at organizing her notes and fragments remained ineffectual. Indeed, from an archival point of view, my little labors produced only disorder, which flourished in the amassed documents as if in black loam. But as I transcribed them, reproducing her words and their syntax as precisely as possible on fresh sheets of white paper, while recognizing that I inevitably introduced error and unintended variation as I progressed, through lapses in attention, tiredness, or misunderstanding, as her cramped yet rushed hand in now outmoded florid cursive was at times difficult to interpret. My dutiful copying out, artisanal and humble, and even ancient in its fundamentally unambitious gesture, transmitted an unintended surplus which figured audaciously, dissonantly, a sensual vibration. Through the slow work of my hands, she is stunningly present to me in the fragments as I copy them out. Not her voice, her speech, which I can't hear or summon from the thick silence of the papers, or not yet, though I sometimes need to stumblingly whisper her words aloud as I read in order to decipher them. It's her person that I sense, her vigorous gait and quick, skeptical side glance, her eager way of leaning in. A physiology of style emerges piecemeal from her documents, a hungry style, an urgent style, a habitually abrupt gestural contraction of time. Papers are crumpled and ink went unblotted. The time of her unquiet body ignites me through my hands. My great-aunt was too hurried, too intellectually driven for modesty. She had no intention of being a woman of so-called quiet achievements. Transcribing her notes, I participate in a lost living. Paris in those years was filled with young researchers who, like my aunt, came to the now decaying 19th century capital in pursuit of an image of aesthetic freedom, to escape their destinies or to escape political discrimination, replacing that stultified blueprint with a robust intellectual dream. Psychoanalysis, philosophy, surrealism, and poetry joined linguistics, photography, and literary studies to animate a new thinking which used the crumbling but compact city as alembic. The young scholars and artists came from Dublin and Berlin, from Toronto and New York, from the French provinces. In Paris, they could live cheaply as they tested their experiments in thought, new patterns and styles of research, while inventing a complex social dream of aesthetics. Walter Benjamin, then in his early 30s, was discovering the 19th century arcades that cut through densely built right bank blocks of the old city, making of them, in his synthetic thinking, an architectural motif of the cultural fertility of commercial obsolescence. This sprawling material research would occupy the last 15 years of his life, as he occupied various bare rooms on the left bank and frequented bordels with his friend Franz Hessel. Benjamin has become one of the more famous researchers of this 1920s Parisian milieu since the appearance of his Illuminations, and since the delayed publication of his Passagen work drafts in notes in 1982. Less is known, perhaps, of his contemporary Enid Starkey, the red-headed, slacks-wearing Irish scholar who would become the great biographer of Baudelaire and Rimbaud, who in Paris pursued her doctoral studies on the Belgian anarchist Émile Verhaeren, identifying deeply with his dandyism. Or Edith Thomas, the archivist biographer of Louise Michel and the women of the 1871 Paris Commune, later the lover of the Gallimard editor and pornographer Anne Duclos, studying to become an archivist at École des Chartes. My aunt's notes had mentioned Starkey and Thomas in passing. Could she have known them? Duclos, a specialist in Baroque English poetry, who in her middle age published her erotic fantasies of submission under the name Pauline Réage, was the first woman to be admitted to the Hippocane, the exclusive Paris preparatory course for superior literary studies. In the late 20s, she was a feminist journalist. At the Bibliothèque Nationale, her close friend, the librarian Georges Bataille, would, during the war and the German occupation, hide in the library the photographic copies of Benjamin's assembled Passagenwerk notes when the German Jewish thinker fled the city in his doomed journey towards asylum. Did my aunt also know Benjamin? I can't be certain. He is not named or cited in her papers. She would have at least heard of his already mythologized perambulatory researches in the then sordid glass-covered arcades. This much would have been talked about in the bars. The Baroque scholar's Baudelaire obsession and his search for the louche remnants of the Second Empire city in the architectural detritus of the present, the junk space in Koolhaas's parlance. When, decades later, following my aunt's traces and seeking her river, I consulted the 1999 English translation of the hefty Passagenwerk tome with its garish gilt-stamped peekaboo cover, the bespectacled Benjamin peering through a die-cut window in the paper jacket. For one does not so much read this book as consult it, as indeed one consults rather than reads an archive or an oracle. It was with definite surprise, even shock, that I found that Benjamin does not ever, in this massive compilation of over 1,000 pages on the seedy life of Paris, its small industry, prostitutes, fashion, social movements, pamphlets, and popular songs, mention the Bièvre River. Not once. Had the two scholars divided the city into dry and wet, as it were, she taking the oozing subterranean conduit, now diverted into sewers, and he the dust-bright aerial passages? Or had my great-aunt's river obsession even motivated Benjamin's drier urban quest? We can't know. Supporting documents have disappeared or perhaps never existed. Ideas traveling immaterially, as they often do, through word of mouth, attitude, gesture, a nudge or pointed glance in a bookshop. In any case, my aunt undertook her river work in the spirit of their time, which is to say gregariously, heretically, partially, using her walks, her scholarly readings of literature, her passion for textile history, her chance encounters, as parts of a sprawling archive of female descent. To immerse herself in her new city, my aunt set up an itinerant project. She would use Rousseau's final book, Reveries of a Solitary Walker, as an iconoclastic Baedeker. She'd follow the routes once taken by the aging philosopher through the contemporary city as she then found it, using his meandering descriptions as guide. She'd learn with amusement that many of the supposed walks had no maps, no discernible routes. What he called walks were often indulgent ruminations or even rants. One walk took place floating supine at dusk in a small wooden boat on a lake. Another described vigorously gritting out a small Swiss island with string. In fact, several of his walks took botanizing as their premise. She was able to follow the second one, along the boulevards, going as far as the Rue du Chemin Vert to the heights of Ménilmontant, as he wrote, where, as was his custom, he stopped to examine and take note of the wayside plants. At the time of Rousseau's wanderings, Ménilmontant was still green, rural, and pleasant, deserted, and his thoughts turned inwards. In brief, as his mind wandered, the philosopher was run over by a speeding dog cart pulled by a Great Dane and knocked unconscious. Now the likelihood of being run over by a dog cart is so completely anachronous that the accident seems comical to describe. But for Rousseau, the trauma of his fall constituted a spiritual turning point. His walk out to the suburban fields to botanize became the account of his accident and the feelings of rebirth he experienced when unable to recall his own name. Entirely taken up by the present, he wrote, I would remember nothing. I had no distinct notion of myself as a person. For the old man, this loss of identity was the greatest pleasure he had experienced in his hectored life. For my great aunt, then a student following Rousseau's footsteps with all of the earnest intent of a neophyte yearning for the glamour of a not yet attained identity, the pleasure he described remained abstract. Following the itinerary of Rousseau's elderly reflection, she came to discover the absent river called the Bièvre, its textile history, its labor, which is also a history of paper, of description, and the river's covert movement through literature. For Rousseau, the banks of the meandering river offered one more sparsely frequented site for botanizing. For my aunt, after the surprise encounter of a description of a river now absent, the botanizing walk out past the Porte d'Enfer would curve back to the library. By then, the river was gone, covered over and diverted, indicated only by signs of old businesses such as Café du Moulin or Quincaillerie du Pont or the remnant Blanchisserie. But in the library, she found that in Rabelais, in Delvau, the Blanquiste boulevardier, who wrote his memoir of a footloose childhood spent beside the river, in Privat d'Anglemont, the Guadeloupean popular historian, in Hugo and the brothers Goncourt, the skimpy trickle was there to be noted and followed. She would trace the Bièvre River through its description in books. For centuries, an artery of urban industrial activity and popular uprising, prone to extreme flash floods, neglected to noxious sediments, the Bièvre was partly diverted into the new vaulted underground sewers of Paris in the early 19th century, to be definitively covered over in 1912, the same year it officially lost its name and its designation as a river. Her lengthening research on relationships among rivers, textiles, and the labor of women returned often to the Bièvre, as I have said, because of the powerful lure of its pollution and slow disappearance. But at times her curiosity led her to other creeks, other neighborhoods, such as the ancient creek of Ménilmontant on the right bank, which became the first open sewer in the 15th century, but had, at an earlier time, provided water to the silk spinners and weavers of the first arrondissement, the silk quarter, as it was called then. Silk production requires much water. In 13th century Paris, the silk industry, then the most lucrative on the continent, was exclusively female. Parisian silk workers formed one of the only all-women guilds in Europe. This was in part because at that time Paris had egalitarian inheritance laws. Widows and unmarried women could legally accumulate capital. Other silk-related women's guilds included associations for the makers of alms purses, small embroidered silk outer pouches worn suspended from a belt, and fringe makers. Many of the silk workers were béguines, independent lay religious women, non-cloistered, who did not marry or submit to any spiritual ordinance, nor take vows, and who often lived in pairs or collectively, engaging in business as well as spiritual study and works of charity. What else was made from the silk produced by the women's guilds? The light, almost transparent silk gauze veils worn by wealthier women at a time when Christian women's head coverings were mandatory, as well as velvets and damasks intended for ecclesiastical robes, altar cloths, and other church decorations, and yard goods destined for garment making. Silk work was concentrated on the Rue de Quincampoix and the Rue Troussevache, now called the Rue de la Renie. There must have been a creek running through the district then down to the Seine, perhaps an arm of the Creek of Ménilmontant. In silk processing, the gum was removed from the fiber by plunging the cocoons briskly into boiling vats, then unwinding them with nimble fingers. The houses of the silk-working Béguines clustered near moving water. Because of their free movement through the city, Béguines were often referred to as wanderers. They had this in common with those other women river workers, the city laundresses, and other heretics of the free spirit, Begards and Cathars. A Franciscan theologian named Gilbert of Tournai said of the Béguines, "There are among us women who we have no idea what to call, religious or lay, because they live neither in the world nor removed from it." The names of the Béguine silk workers: Adeline the Béguine, silk spinner; Agnès the Béguine, silk spinner; Agnès of Senlis, Béguine, silk spinner; Ameline the Béguine, silk spinner; Ameline the Navette, the shuttle, Béguine, silk spinner; Basile the Béguine, silk spinner; Basilette the Béguine, silk spinner; Gilles of Calradon, silk spinner; Isabelle la Béguine, spins silk; Isabelle of Lemoy, silk spinner; Jeanne the Béguine, 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 silk spinner; Juliette the Béguine, spins silk; Mahut of Cholet, silk spinner; Mahut of the Cross, Béguine, silk spinner; Thomas the Béguine, silk spinner; Thomas the Normand, silk spinner. The Béguines were women who appeared for the city and for each other. Senlis, Calradon, Limoy, Cholet, Normandy, they came to Paris from elsewhere, from other European textile towns, often in northern France or Flanders, bringing with them their knowledge, both textile and spiritual, sharing houses, workshops, and teachings. When the church ruled that Béguinage was a punishable heresy in 1310, burning Marguerite Porret at the stake in Paris for writing and circulating theological texts which contradicted Catholic dogma, it was exercising a disciplinary pattern established a century earlier against those other weavers, the Albigensian Cathars, in the gruesome crusade that was prolonged by a century-long inquisition in the Southwest and in Italy. Was my aunt a historian of heresy? No, perhaps. The persistent relation of textile trades to heretical movements and communities in urban centers during the medieval period were there to be noted and pursued. Free women spoke together as they sat at their looms or stooped over the laundry at riverbanks. Itinerant weavers of this free spirit, such as the Cathars, the Béguines, the Waldensians, and the Humiliati, also practiced lay preaching, including in their communities literate unmarried women and skilled working people whose role in the rise of vernacular literature endangered church authority. Against church-established institutions of marriage, monasticism, priesthood, and aristocratic descent, Heresy was a category of popular disorder, a kind of speech punishable with death. Its victims were often independent weavers of wool and linen, leather workers, shoemakers, purse makers, or beggars, both men and women, according to the geographic region. The association of skilled artisanal trades with heretical, literate self-organization and free movement constituted a popular force dangerous to church cohesion, to the point where councils of inquisition considered the word weaver to be interchangeable with the word heretic. Heresy, otherwise defined, was a free and often itinerant association of egalitarian, self-educating workers who shared resources and mutual spiritual guidance and rejected hierarchical superstructures. My aunt's textile research was of a piece with heretical counterhistories. Did she consider her own work in the light of this submerged tradition? I'm not yet able to say, but it was founded by the absent path of the little river. Thank you.
Lisa, would you like to sit here and maybe
Sure.
we can start a conversation? I would be happy to start it if that makes sense. I am just in awe of this work, which, as I said in the introduction to this symposium yesterday, does emerge, and I know that you think of it this way, as an arcades project of the Bièvre. And I'm just like really overwhelmed by the multidisciplinary necessity and weight of what you've done here that really brings together all of this archival research with philosophical thinking that really has, how many years has it been that you've been not only reading but writing about Rousseau and these perambulations, for instance, just the meaning of perambulation and the path of it, and how perambulation influences thought. So that's just a comment, really. I'm just like basking in the afterglow or something of that reading. So I guess it can lead to a question, which is about perambulation and the rivers meandering, and whether perhaps it was, the relationship between walking, motion, as a form of thought or an accompaniment to thought that has been so important in your work since at least, is it 6 walks and occasional work?
7, yeah.
7 walks and occasional works from the Office for Soft Architecture, which I wrote about when I was like a wee lass, like some 20, years ago or something, but still go back to over and over. So I guess I would invite you to comment on the relationship of thought to movement through space, and how the human walk and the rivers meandering might be related. I know there are myriad other reasons why you would be drawn to the Bièvre. It's just, as I was sort of rambling in my own discourse and thinking through it, this is one element of it that rises to the surface for me.
Yeah, okay. Where shall I begin with that, Jen?
Begin anywhere.
Well, it is the case that I've been very interested in walking as a form of research that's sort of situated in a landscape and embodied. And I think that notion, I mean, it's not a very unusual notion. First, for me, arrived when my friends and I first encountered in the late 80s the Situationists' work, and there was a lot of publication of the dérive of the Situationists coming out at that time from various sort of anarchist presses and little catalogs and so forth. So I was part of a community that obsessively was reading this material. So when I came to read Rousseau later, I began to read Rousseau simply because I was obsessed with Ian Hamilton Finlay and had visited Finlay's garden in Scotland in sort of my first overseas trip as a young adult. And I went there with the plan to write about the garden and hopefully to construct a slide lecture. It was still the time of photographic slides. And I spent quite a while talking with Mr. Finlay when I was there, and I discovered that there was no way that I could write about Finlay without having read Rousseau, that it just was not possible. So that sent me on the path of reading Rousseau. And no, I never did do the slide lecture on Finlay's garden, but he got me reading Rousseau. And for me, the reading I was doing sort of systematically through his various texts joined with my background, my more youthful background in the Situationist dérive. So those things kind of overlaid one another as ways of experiencing urban space and the suppressed histories in urban space. And I started systematically walking with friends in Vancouver and making kind of performative texts out of those walks. So, this work is you think you change and you're starting new projects, but actually I discovered that after all these decades of writing, I'm still writing the same book.
In very delightsome variations, and formally, sprawlingly different kinds of projects. It occurs to me as you're saying that since the Bièvre was covered up, then to write about it is another form of under the paving stones the beach.
Yeah.
This exhumation, there's so much that's being exhumed in the work from the histories of labor, of gendered labor, to the river itself, to the archivist herself, and really clearly what is so important also is a history of women as intellectuals and as laborers, which it strikes me that this is going to be a really important contribution to historiography. But one that's a lot more fun to read than some. I mean, I really like reading histories myself, but one that gives you a persona around which to pivot.
Yeah.
So I don't want to dominate the conversation. I can continue to chat, but also just to say we have this. We have two microphones that can roam throughout the room.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that very much. And I was really struck by, I think also hearing that after today and the talking about the work of rivers, and what I was noticing was the use of the list as this kind of propulsive force in what you're writing, and a sense of the river as a sort of receptacle for these kind of sediments of the past, which I I mean, it's also like that kind of layering as well from Benjamin. But I was really, so I was thinking, this the list and the relation between the list and memory, and then this kind of uncertainty about whose memory it is and whose research, and so I was just very I suppose I'm interested in the kind of the decisions about form here, and I love that you were asking us to participate in that earlier, something that is still unsettled, and I wondered if you could say something maybe about lists and novels.
Yeah. I've been. I think that the paratactic structure of the list is one of the things we work with as poets quite often, and it's horizontal grammar that I've definitely had recourse to in many of my books of poetry. And one of the things that interests me in this temporary sort of sideways move into writing novels, there won't be another one after this, just the two, is how the things I've learned about structure, transition, syntax, parataxis in the composition of the poem, how applicable they feel to me within the longer prose form of the novel. I mean, in a way, because my background is in poetry and not in narrative construction, in a normative novelistic sense, it's not unusual that I should bring what I learn from my practice as a poet into this detour into novel writing. But I remain curious to observe how it functions differently in the novel, or how I can disrupt the narrative expectations of a novel using the techniques and the formal developments that I've learned as a poet. So I'm very interested in the blurring of these literary forms and how the poem can become a novel or interrupt the novel or capsize the novel in a way.
And also there's something about the scale of the novel for uncovering something considered to be small and hidden that seems very appropriate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we all know that Ursula Le Guin quote about the novel being a shopping bag or something, and in a sense, it does have that capaciousness. You can put a lot of stuff into it. So that's one of the sort of difficult temptations, I think. So I'll pop that in too. I just put that in a side pocket.
Thank you.
What that conversation reminds me of while we wait for the next question is, I remember you describing Caroline Bergval's Via to me as an ambient text, and then writing something that never got published, because that's what I do, is write things that never get published, about the weather and about the ambient and immersive in your work. And so there is this tension between the kind of ambient, immersive creation of a space, and which is also a lyrical suspension, and the linearity of the novel, it occurs to me. But one of the things, to go back to Dilip da Cuna's opening keynote, was very much against the line, the imposition of a line and the containment of a river by a line. You did something wonderful for us just geographically and historically, in that tracing out of all the little rivulets that are present in these different streets of Paris. Like I was seeing the water coming up, bubbling up in these different streets of Paris that I now know by name. And thus you are really disrupting this fiction of the river as this linear thing and really letting bubble up, this kind of wetness everywhere that wants to emerge. Yeah. So it's really neat to think about the work formally, how it's kind of occupying the seemingly linear form of the novel with these other tactics.
I think one of the really difficult things for me as I'm getting to these later stages of composition is to stop the remontaging. The great pleasure for me has been in making sort of doing edits for specific situations, and so pulling in pieces from all over. And so I've been doing that for several years at various readings. And what's going to happen is that the text will have to be fixed. Its sequence will, soon be determined. And although at this point I am eager to be finished with this project, the determining of the fixed sequence is the least pleasurable aspect of writing it, because I could just imagine continually sort of doing new cuts, pulling in outside material, letting other stuff go, and just the ongoing movement of that sort of, flooding and retracting of material is, for me, the real compositional pleasure in figuring out ways to activate research within this long prose form.
Although, just to fill people in who were not present on the boat, what Lisa had us do was activate different moments of this text, both her own historical syntheses surrounding different aspects of the Bièvre, from the piss that was used as mordant to tin salts and various revolutionary histories, laundresses who were communards, and they were written out on index cards, and she invited people in the space to activate all of these fragments. And so they were chorally read in space in a nonlinear fashion. And it strikes me that the book is a very flexible technology, even though we don't usually give it credit for that. It doesn't need to be read nonlinearly. A work like Cortázar's Hopscotch, it literally invites you to hop all around it, and you could potentially invite readers to read it in a different way, or just performatively activate it in that way, which was really pleasing to be part of, and I didn't want it to end, particularly because it was performed against the illustrious monumental backdrop of the Seine, which is, as I had anxiety about, very difficult to upstage. But in this particular case, the illustrious monuments of the Louvre and so forth were upstaged by these laundresses and these chemical substances that Lisa has researched and placed into this work for us. I'm sure by now there are several wandering questions.
Thank you for this talk, which was amazing. And I really want to ask a question because I just enjoyed the talk so much. But there were a lot of things. Thank you very much for explaining the connection between laundresses and anarchy, because when Picasso started setting up his studio in Montmartre, in a place that was called the the Trapper's Paradise. He renamed it the Bateau Lavoir, and I didn't realize that was because it was to whisper to people that this was an anarchist spot. But I was very interested in the fact that Rousseau doesn't want to hear his name at all, and that just got me to thinking about all the things he is hearing and about the sounds that rivers make. We talk about a babbling brook, and I was wondering, since we only had a little excerpt of the novel, is there something about the speech that emerges from the sounds of the rivers swishing and bubbling and babbling and such like?
Not overtly.
Okay.
Is the short answer. In part because I'm mainly talking about a river that is non-existent. I mean, there are places on the old bed in this neighborhood where you can get down on your hands and knees and put your ear against a sewer cover and hear a trickling. But you kind of risk getting run over. So the kind of pastoral babbling of little brooks is not really a feature of the material that I've been following regarding the Bièvre.
It's part of what's been lost, right?
Yeah,
It's a book about what's lost, what's irrecoverable.
Yeah.
Olivier.
At some stage, you said, I think, maybe I dreamt the document. And I was wondering if you could tell us about dreaming the document and not dreaming the document, or telling us about your relationship to the document. Does it change? How do you live with the document?
Well, I think that most of us in this room are people who have researched as, an important part of what we do with our time in the world. And it inevitably seeps into dream life. And I'm certain that I'm among many others in waking up having made an amazing archival discovery, but not being able to quite find it again. I mean, there's a certain way in which doing sort of traditionally speaking research in a formal archive, because of the density of those spaces, it does become, and because of the role that serendipity plays, in spite of all of our best laid methodological entry points and techniques for working with an archive. The archive is a kind of dream work in a way. I mean, you go to the archive with a question. That's the nature of research, is you've got some kind of question. But in my experience in going to an archive with the question, it's almost always the wrong question. And you almost always have to jettison that question because you discover a better question. You discover what, for a time, seems like the real question. And then you follow that for a time until, etc. So I feel like the actual form of work of doing archival research in, even in an institutional setting, or almost especially in an institutional setting, because of it's as confines. It is opening and closing hours. It has, ways that you request documents. It's very structured. So the constraint of the institutional constraint of the archival space makes it almost an ideal frame for a kind of dream work to occur. And so for me, these two forms, I mean, and a dream is a form of research. You know, you're trying to get at something in that dream. Something that you've experienced has been sort of reshuffled into a new narrative, or something a completely unknown image erupts. I mean, these two forms of cognitive work, for me, profoundly inform one another. And then, of course, we always have a dream of a sort of ideal research, you know, that we're going to go to some, you know, you travel to some other city to make use of an archive, or you take a bus across the city you live in and, you know, try to be there at opening time. And, you know, you've got to dream of you know, what's going to happen. You know, you're going to find this marvelous series of documents that's going to just, you know, open up a new world. And usually it doesn't happen. And then you're sort of stuck with this dull stuff that you have found, and then you have to kind of make it interesting. So it's the work of the archive is so much like a form of sort of psychic labor, that I'm endlessly fascinated with that overlap. You know, I mean, what is research? I mean, where, you know, maybe a life is a research.
Can I just ask a brief follow-up on that about which kinds of archives, in addition to reading histories that brought out for you the history of women communards, particularly laundresses, and most particularly this Creole laundress who was an important actor and who...
Victorine Gorget.
Victorine Gorget.
Just to say her name.
To say her name. How did you find her, having kind of...
Yeah. There's... There was a woman, she was a woman named Edith Thomas. She was French. She was a librarian at the Archives Nationales. Prior to that, she worked in the Bibliothèque Nationale briefly, and she studied at the École des Chartes, which is the sort of national training school for archivists in France. Edith Thomas, alongside her professional work as a librarian and an archivist, she was a communist, a member of the Communist Party who left the Communist Party, and she was a historian. And almost all of the historical texts which she wrote have to do with political histories of women. And there's a book which has been translated into English, but I've just read the French translation, called Les Pétroleuses. And pétroleuse was one of the slang terms for the women members of the Communard, of the Paris Commune of 1871. And this book is about the women of 1871, who were said to be running around with torches burning down buildings at night. So that's why it was called Les Pétroleuses. So she is interested. She's also written on Louise Michel, who's a member of the Paris Commune, who we more typically know about. Like Douglas Oliver has written about Louise Michel. There have been poets have worked on her work, and her memoirs were republished in the 1960s during the student movement. So she's been very present in sort of resistance movements and anarchist movements in 20th century France. But I started coming across lists in Edith Thomas' book of who these women were and what their jobs were. And a big proportion of them were laundresses. And so, but she doesn't go into laundry work. And she doesn't go into Victorine Gorget at all. She's just named. So what I've found is a lot of really interesting websites, basically, by some of them are sort of hobbyist. They're feminist historians who do this kind of work as a as a kind of for pleasure. They're not professional historians, academics. So there's these whole networks of websites that are almost entirely written by women, that are delving into the documentary histories of these women laundresses, including websites which post scans or facsimiles of the police reports when the women were all arrested and taken to a prison in Versailles, a women's prison in Versailles. They were all photographed and questioned by the cops, and all of those interrogations are actually available as scans online. So you can, you've got to discern. Some of them are sort of transcribed into typography. I forget what that word is. I should know. Diplomatic translation, diplomatic transcription, and some of them just remain as scans. But you can read the words, what the laundresses of the Paris Commune said to the police, and they're there on websites. So I did a great deal. I did most of this research online, actually, just making use of these kind of community level feminist websites that are, storing and presenting documentary evidence.
Hopefully they're not American, because if
No,
they
they're
were,
French.
they would be potentially in danger right now of
And
being obliterated.
they're not sponsored by institutions. They're really kind of, some of them seem like some of their design is really kind of janky and weird, and you think, oh, this is really kind of Mickey Mouse. But then you start reading it and you see all of this work that's being done. And so a lot of the research I did was in those kinds of websites, but also I've discovered this vein of historians of industry, and these journals, which are just journals of where historians of industry publish their work. And there's a guy named Thomas Leroux who has done a great deal of work on laundry. So I've been following Thomas Leroux's work as it's published in various journals. And so I've sort of discovered various veins. In the past, most of the research I've done, I've sort of fetishized, like going to the Warburg Institute and, doing this, interacting with the books and all of that. Or in Vancouver, I would go to the Vancouver City Archives, and, you're just pulling out all kinds of bizarre objects.
Or Cambridge, the weather.
Exactly. I really fetishize the materiality of various archives that I've been able to access. And so one of the weird things about this one is this project is a great deal of the work I've done has been online. Some of it's just like I've ordered Delvau's books, and so got these old 19th century books. Nobody cares about him, so they're not expensive. So there's a certain amount of, buying and handling. But because I've been doing most of the work in the country and not actually spending much time, not really spending time at all in libraries, it's been a much different process for me. And frankly, it's these sort of archives that have been encountering and making use of on the internet were exactly the kind of research I would have been quite scornful about when I was younger, because of my intense fetishization of the materiality of the paper and the site and the travel to the archive and all of the sort of ritual kind of claptrap that you can dramatize around that work. I was all for it, and I still am. I still am. But as it ended up, that's not what I ended up doing for this book. And to be honest, I feel a little bit ashamed about it. But I've also just found extremely rich veins, you know. You go down this wormhole and you're reading the police reports, you know, and you know, reading the verbatim responses of women who were about to be shipped off to New Caledonia. And yeah.
Well, it doesn't strike me that that's something to be ashamed about at all. On the contrary, the internet is a precious resource, and we all, especially those of us who live in the United States, need to defend these archives that have been digitized, because they're probably the most vulnerable, since burning an actual book looks bad. It's a lot easier to just obliterate digitized.
Push a button. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself but ask that question. So there was a question right in the middle of the room.
Is it on? Yeah, that was a great question with a great answer, so that's fine. I want to thank you so much for this really evocative water course that you took us on. You shared with us. I was really struck by the lushly visible material elements, like the wetness of paper, the warp and the woof of the textiles, and kind of I was thinking against like artistic hierarchies. Disclosure that I'm an art historian, so I was wondering if you could dilate a little bit on visuality, like the visual, and how that's functioning in this project for you.
Yeah. Well, I feel that a lot of my curiosity seems to be most immediately incited almost by the haptic more than the visual, and I think a lot of my interest in textile has to do with that, but in connection with the sort of textural touch of materiality. I've been increasingly interested in the gestural capacities, which is entering into the realm of the image at that point. In this book, I'm not describing painting. When I wrote my previous novel, The Baudelaire Fractal, that was a sort of a strong kind of repeating motif in it, was descriptions of paintings. And that was a way to bring historical material into the time of narration. That does not happen at all. I don't think so. Not that I can recall at this moment. Partly because I'm more, as is evident from the conversation so far, I'm really much more engaged in the politics of labor, different kinds of labor. So the sort of visual residue or imprint of labor is more of a sort of gestural movement than it is an image in any sort of fixed or still way. And yet I do think, well, I mean, I'm really influenced by Aby Warburg's works. So the dynamism of gesture, the charge of moving textile, the representation of textile on the body, I do think with Warburg that it's carrying a human historical charge through time. So Yeah, I think that reading Voorburg's work, like his art historical essays that are collected in that big blue volume, whatever it's called, from the Getty, I think it gave me a lot of permission in going further into textile history. So I have been directly influenced by art history through his work and subsequent critics and readers and researchers in the Voorburgian strain, and his insistence in the way he approached research of including the minor. So a big part of his work is looking at like popular festival and theater costume and astrology and all of these sort of forms of knowledge which are not considered to be high art, and so that was one of the things he did for the history of art was bring all of these modes of minor practice, tradition, transmission into the discourse of into a history of representation. So I have worked in that library a bit. I spent like a full-time month in there once. I had a research residency at Queen Mary, University of London, which I just went, every day that it was open from the time that the doors open until the time that the doors closed. And sometimes they had to sort of pull me out. But that period only lasted for a month. And then I've gone a few other times when I've had, 2, 3 days, 2, 3, 4 days in London to kind of have a mini query. So I'm not somebody who's like done my doctorate in that space. I don't have that profound knowledge of the space. I have enough of a knowledge of the space to really fetishize it, glamorize it, but also to have had my own strong interest in minor and often feminized crafts, practices, forms of domesticity, given a kind of it's given me a permission. I mean, one of the things that I noticed that is in the Voorburg Library is that the cookbook writer Elizabeth David, her whole collection of books. So I love reading cookbooks, and so suddenly it's like, oh my God, the Voorburg Library is actually also about the history of cooking and the domestic arts. So this idea that domestic, various forms of domesticity, domestic materiality, cooking, cleaning, mending, what traditionally many women have learned from childhood, as being part of a history of civilization was really moving and meaningful to me, and I think definitely has given me a lot of permission in some of the veins of some of the queries that I've undertaken in this book.
Thank you.
So it's almost time to allow people to partake of the snacks that we have for you. But it's like there's 2 minutes left. I do want to, if someone is burning with a question that they want to issue into the great room for Lisa, then I don't want to shut you down. But Okay.
Thank you. This is great. I really caught by many lines, but by the line, a new thinking which used the crumbling compact city as an alembic, and just falling on Voorburg and evocation of Voorburg. Also, you talked about sort of the remontage for specific occasions, so to make something happen. Is there a kind of alchemy at work? I mean, there's moments in your reading where it became a chant, and it's sort of like so. Mm-hmm. is, what are you making? I mean, I don't want you to answer, that's a dumb question, but just, maybe it's just a thought, not a question, but is there a kind of alchemy that you're chasing?
Well, I think that composing in language is that, in that we're not quite sure what the outcome will be, yet we're following an effective, we're constructing relationships in order to see whether newly imagined relationships could end up at an altered experience of materiality and therefore of living. So sure, I mean basically, okay, I'm not sort of like a Wiccan practitioner or something like this. I'm not like, I do sit pebbles on windowsills, but I don't have a personal altar. Big confession. I'm a big pebble on windowsill sitter of, but I don't. There are lots of poets who are invested in magic as a practice, and I'm not one of them. And I'm interested in it, but that's not part of what I do. Yet I think that part of the reason we do this kind of work that we do is because we're interested in transformation. And we don't know how change occurs. And so we're trying things out. And those transformations have to do with the relations of our bodies to history, to the relationships of language to memory, tradition, and to new social formations, ideally. So, yeah, I'm interested in transformation. And so I use those words in that sense, and that's, that's, I think what if we make a book, we want the constraint of the book to hold the potential of a transformation. Why else bother? Because there's a lot of books in the world already, and coming off the presses as we speak. So why would you make another one of these damn things if you didn't have some sort of hope that you could understand something different or make some new proposition about what the nature of change is in human history, language, and social relationships?
Well, I really can't think of a better way to end this symposium during a very terrible time in the history of the nation that sponsors this institution, Hope and Transformation. So I will just say this hereby concludes the formal part of the 3-year project, the Geopoetics of Urban Rivers, Chicago to Seine, Calumet to Marne, Seine edition. And we invite you into the hallway and the terrace, if you dare be under the sun, for some libations and snacks. Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing this amazing work with us and giving us these 2 very different previews of it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jane.